humidity happens, it's hard to near impossible for that sweat to really cool you down. You'll still be sweating, but it won't have that same effect.
Right. It's just there's no place for that sweat to go. It doesn't just move into the air because there's already so much water vapor into the air. So the higher the humidity is, the worse off it is for you. And then if you take high temperatures as well, that combination of high humidity and high temperature can be really bad. And back in the 70s, there was a guy, actually in 1979, somebody named R.G. Stedman. They came up in 1979 with assessment of sultriness, which we call today the heat index. It was the paper that put the heat index out there. And the heat index is
that was
basically...
way too sexy.
Yeah, it really is. You know, it sounds like a Tennessee Williams play or something like that.
Yeah.
So the heat index makes a lot of sense because when it's really humid out and it's high in temperature, that humidity makes it feel even hotter because we have trouble sweating. So R.G. Stedman came up with the heat index that kind of gives you a much better understanding of what the actual temperature as far as your human body is concerned. That's why they also call it the apparent temperature or the feels like temperature.
Yeah, and that's the only one I care about. I don't even know why they list regular temperature. It should just be heat index and wind chill in the winter.
Yeah.
Because that's the only thing that matters. And I guess, you know, it's like showing your math or something, so they have to go through it all. But as far as your human body is concerned, those are really the only two measures that matter, or at least for me.
Yeah, so you know how sometimes you can end up down a rabbit hole and like not find a way out, and you have to just crawl backwards out of it, and you're kind of worse off for the wear because you went a little mad in there?
Sure.
That happened to me with humidity, heat index, evaporation, condensation. I'm like
researching it.
Yeah. And I'm like, there's some connections here between all these things that my brain is not making. I'm just sensing that it's all very much connected, and I'm even reading stuff that's saying it's connected. I just can't figure out how it's all connected because it's not as simple as like humidity the heat index is humidity times temperature divided by 2 or something like that. That's not how it works. It's way more sophisticated than that, and it takes into account a lot of different stuff, so that if you actually put a lower temperature in with higher humidity, it'll bring the temperature down. And then there's some temperatures, like say 70 degrees, where it doesn't really matter what you do with the humidity, it's still just going to feel like 70 degrees. So there's like a lot of different weirdness in there. But the thing is, the upshot of all this, I was just kind of confessing and getting off my chest that I'm a little obsessed with this. And if any meteorologist or climatologist can explain all this to me, I would love to hear it. But as far as heat waves are concerned, if you have high temperatures and high humidity, some really astounding stuff happens when you put those together as far as the heat index is concerned.
Yeah, and just not to harp on my personal sweating issues. We've talked about it a lot over the years, but it's the embarrassing thing for me is not that I sweat a lot, because that's why I never had like acne growing up, because I'm just constantly sweating everything through.
Right.
I've got like the cleanest pores in the world. And it, helps cool me down, but it's when it's like 76 degrees and super humid, and other people are like, or even in the 60s or 50s, and they're like, it's really cool. Why are you sweating? I'm like, because it's humid. I don't care if it's 40 degrees. If it's super humid, I might break a sweat.
Yeah,
it's through.
If you're sweating at 40 degrees, that's some sweatiness for sure.
Maybe not 40.
50?
We could do some tests.
All right, let's do some science. I'm gonna get a lab
to set up a humidity lab or something.
Okay, but I still get to get a lab coat, right?
Oh, sure.
Of the color of my choosing?
I'll let you select from 3 colors of my choosing.
What are they? Cinnamon, powder blue, and orange.
Okay, great.
Okay, any one of those then. That's mine. That's mine too.
Banana yellow was going to be in there, but you missed the boat.
At least you didn't make me dress up in a banana costume.
It's funny. I was shopping for Halloween for this year, and I kind of want to go as Devo, and so I was looking up for those yellow jumpsuits, and I was waylaid because you kind of end up having to be whatever your kid says you have to be. So I think we're all going to be spooky things this year, but I had to put the Devo thing on the back burner.
You could be like Zombie Devo.
No, not a bad idea.
No, it's not. It's a great idea.
Yeah, you could be zombie anything. That's kind of the beauty of the zombie.
Right.
Zombie Bjork.
Zombie Mark Mothersbaugh. Zombie Bjork, I like that.
Just wear that swan dress and walk around saying brains.
Right, there you go.
I was trying to think of how Bjork would say brains, but my head couldn't put it together. That was perfect. So you mentioned insidious effects, and we're going to talk about those because very wide-reaching. It's not just people get hot and people die. Mm-hmm. It affects kind of everything on the planet. And it's easy to kind of think of heat stroke and dehydration and something like that during the day, like you said, because that's when you count on it and that's when you might take precautions.
Which, by the way, go listen to our desert survival episode for that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. Good tips there. Mm-hmm. But at night, like you said, that's when it's really bad because the human body really depends on that rest and that reset and that cool down. And if you stay hot, your body, and especially if you have like high blood pressure or like heart issues, mm-hmm. it's working overtime at night when it should be cooling down because I think your like lowest body temperature of the 24-hour cycle is during sleep. So if you're not hitting that cool down cycle, then everything is just doing a lot of extra work.
Yeah, and in particular, your heart is. And when your heart is working hard and then it has to work hard again the next day, it's like that set point doesn't ever, or the set point starts higher the next day. So after a few days of this, especially if you have a bum ticker to begin with, it can be quite dangerous for you. And so people like the elderly, children, like very young children, they're usually the first casualties of a heat wave. But there are a lot of other people who are susceptible too, especially people who don't have easy access to air conditioning, people who are of low income, who very sadly might even have air conditioning but don't have power right then, or don't have the money to run their air conditioner, the homeless. People who work outside and I gotta work no matter what to keep food on the table, whether it's a heat wave or not, they can be in big trouble as well. But then so can any of us, especially when that heat index starts to jump, like when you have like 100-degree temperatures with like 55% humidity, you put those together, it's suddenly 124 out. That's not good for anybody,
No, and I mentioned earlier that it's like people and animals and buildings and everything. The infrastructure takes, it takes a hit. Mm-hmm. Like railroad tracks can literally warp and buckle.
Yeah, they won't run trains during a heat wave a lot of times for that reason because they could derail.
Yeah, concrete and asphalt, any kind of metal and glass on a building. Buildings can, like their shape can briefly change and expand and contract, or I guess expand and not contract for a little while.
That's nuts.
All due to this heat wave. And, we talked a little bit about the urban heat island effect at some point. But this is why you go to New York City and a heat wave, and it's one of the hottest places on the planet, it feels like.
Yeah, because it actually is way hotter than other places because of all those building materials, number one, that are excellent absorbers of heat. All that blacktop and asphalt and all that steel, but also, Chuck, like the distinct lack of vegetation, like trees and stuff that actually help cool the air. Like it's not just shade that they do, like they actually like release water vapor into the air and actually cool the nearby air. So the more trees you have, the lower the urban heat island effect. But that's just not like a huge trait of the average city. Like somebody actually wrote a book called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. That's mm-hmm. how significant the idea of a tree in Brooklyn was. You know what I'm saying?
That's funny. Energy takes a big wallop too, for the obvious reason and more. The obvious one being that, everyone's cranking those air conditioners, everyone's refrigerators and freezers are working overtime. Mm-hmm. Industrial refrigeration is working overtime. And you combine that with the fact that transmission capacity is reduced during these high temperatures. It's going to strain the electrical grid even more. Mm-hmm. It's just nothing is running with any kind of efficiency. And if you want to really have some people die quickly, you have an energy power outage during a heat wave because of these overstressed systems. And that's when all of a sudden, like, nobody has refrigeration or air conditioning, and it can get brutal pretty quickly.
Yeah, because I mean, if you think about it, you've got incredible demand on the system, and then the system itself can't really, it can't get rid of its waste heat like it needs to, just like a human body does. So yeah, if the system blacks out or even browns out, that's not the time to do it, but that's when it's most likely to happen. And then on the opposite side of the same coin, Chuck, are those cold waves I was talking about. And that was what happened in Texas this past winter.
Yeah.
It was a high pressure front, but instead of a mass of like super hot air, it was a mass of super cold air, and it just settled in and stayed there and froze Texas. And Texas's infrastructure suffered. I think we talked about it on the electrical grid episode. And it was the same thing. They just couldn't keep up with the demand, and the weather itself was taxing the system too. And it's the same thing in a heat wave. It's just for the opposite reasons, but the same outcome.
Right. And if you're thinking, hey, look at the bright side, warmer winters mean we're not going to be using as much energy in the wintertime to heat our homes. So it all balances out. That's not true. They've done a lot of studies, and they're pretty much coming to the conclusion that the heat is tipping that scale too far in the other direction. And even if we are saving a little bit of energy or even a great deal of energy in the wintertime due to warmer temperatures, it's not going to balance it out.
Right. Water is another big one too, Chuck, which makes a lot of sense. Like, people drink more water, they need more water. They might take cool baths to cool down, but not just humans. Livestock need more water during this time. Power plants need more water to stay cool. Crops need more water. Everything needs more water. But the problem is during a heat wave, when you need water the most, that's when it's like the least available, because it becomes pretty scarce, because drought and heat waves they work really well together. They kind of go hand in hand, actually, in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of creates a similar feedback loop, in that when there is moisture in the ground, thanks to rain and stuff like that, even when it gets hot, the earth is going to soak up a lot of that sun and use some of that energy to get rid of that water and turn it into water vapor. If that ground is already super dry because of a drought, then it's basically just baking like an oven, and that energy has no other use. It doesn't have the use of turning it into water vapor, so it's just baking.
Yeah, just heating that ground up instead, so it just gets hotter and hotter, which is terrible stuff. So plus also with drought-stricken landscapes, those are more susceptible to wildfire. So as there's more and more heat waves, we can expect worse and more widespread wildfires, basically, too.
Yeah.
We talked about animals.
Yeah.
It's not animals. I think a lot of people forget about animals in situations like this. I think people think more about animals when it gets super, super cold and like really bad cold fronts come in. But they're susceptible to the heat too. And it's not just, our little, domesticated pets that we love. And unfortunately, some of the street animals like really suffer. But livestock, if you're on a farm, those cows and chickens don't like that kind of heat either. Sometimes it can affect their mortality rates. It can affect things way downstream, because they might be they don't want to have that heat wave sex either.
That's true.
So they might be reproducing less, which is going to have a downstream effect. And then, all the crops are going to be affected too.
Yeah, especially the ones that cops want to come snatch.
That what?
Cops want to come and snatch my crops.
What is that?
You don't remember that as a Cypress Hill lyric, a very famous one.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I remember now. Boy, we've mentioned Cypress Hill a lot on the show.
Yeah. They're kind of like they're like a mascot now, like Frank the Chair.
I knew that sounded familiar. Cops come and try to snatch my crops.
There it is. And then that has to be followed, of course, by heat wave.
Right. Boy, somebody should sample that on a hip hop tune. That'd be great.
What? Heat wave.
Yeah, I bet it has been.
Sure. I could see Puff Daddy sampling that. That'd be up his alley.
Oh yeah? Did I ever tell you I went to his house one time?
It sounds vaguely familiar, but I'd like to hear it again.
It's not the biggest story, but I ran an errand as a PA over to his house one time and had to drop something out, so I had to go and knock on his door and walk inside the front and drop something off.
Something? Was something in air quotes?
No, it was something for the job. It wasn't a big deal, but it was like clothes or something. But it was just very shiny and white. Everything was shiny and white.
I can imagine, which is, it's a way to go, I guess. But I don't.
Yeah, it's a look.
It's too much. It's too much.
I don't know. I mean, this was a long time ago. He may not be into that now, but white couches and big white marble floors.
I mean, I like white couches and I do like white stuff, but it's also like gotta have lots of color. Like the white stuff is just a backdrop for your color. That's my opinion.
We are too messy. We can't have white things.
I understand. Yeah. Well, you need to have, if you have a white couch, it's got to be a slip cover because you're gonna have to wash it.
Yes, if you drink red wine.
But there is one that we haven't covered yet. I think we should before we take a break, and it is air pollution, which might be overlooked by some people, but it really makes a lot of sense because number one, we're like demanding way more from power plants than usual during a heat wave with all that AC. So those power plants are putting out more emissions than usual. But then the actual like conditions of the heat wave itself make the air pollution worse, does it not?
Yeah, I mean that same cap that kind of forces all that air down and keeps everything stagnant, that same cap is in place for these emissions that are going up into the air. Mm-hmm. So it's just like bottling it all up. It's going to make things a lot worse.
Yeah, and also ozone is more easily produced. So you've got ozone and like particulate matter from emissions all combining to make your breathing much more difficult and dangerous.
That's right.
So let's take a break, man, and then we'll talk about some couple of famous heat waves and what the future holds. How about that?
Let's do it.
Learning stuff with Joshua and Charles. Stuff you should know.
Get ready for Nate's biggest showcase of the year. Visit our virtual open house to discover how you can be future ready with Nate.
Explore career-focused programs and learn about the hands-on, technology-based learning that gives Nate students the edge.
Join us online. Explore over 100 virtual booths featuring Nate programs and services. Chat with instructors and students. Attend presentations. Take a virtual tour of campus and more.
Visit Nate's virtual open house on Saturday, October 30th. Don't miss it.
Registration is required. Learn more and register at nate.ca/openhouse.
So if you were alive on the Earth this summer, you might remember in June.
Almost said it. You almost started with it, and you didn't. You've really come a long way, Chuck.
With what?
You almost said unless you were living under a rock.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I really wasn't.
All right.
So between June 20th and June 23rd, something was brewing down in Mexico that was very hot. Mm-hmm. And this big, massive warm air moved up and kind of settled over the middle of the United States and didn't move for a while. And it was just sort of your classic heat wave. But even in places like where they're used to the heat in the summertime, it got exceedingly hot.
Yeah.
Like if you were in Arizona and Phoenix, you're used to hot weather for sure. But it cracked 115 degrees for 6 consecutive days, which is a record for even Phoenix.
That is not okay for anybody.
No.
But so it's bad enough for Phoenix, but still, I'm sure the people of Phoenix are like, yeah, it's kind of hot, but come on, we could handle worse. It was places where it's not normally hot at all that really took the brunt of that heat wave. And as a matter of fact, the heat wave is generally called or referred to as the Pacific Northwest heat wave because that's where it really stunk the worst.
Yeah, I can't believe Portland, Oregon got up to 112 degrees. That is bananas.
Yeah, and we should say, when you're talking about air temperatures and you are seeing the temperature on the news or whatever, that measurement was taken in the shade. That's not the sunshine temperature. That's what the temperature is in the shade. Okay, so wrap your head around that one, bucko.
Yeah, so 112 in Portland, 104 in Seattle, which broke a record. It was bananas, and that kind of, like, a lot of people in that part of the country. I don't really know percentages, but there are people who don't have HVAC units. They count on opening their windows and stuff like that. There are still places in the United States, believe it or not, that don't have HVAC and that use ceiling fans and stuff and windows.
They
and
just don't need it.
That does the trick.
Yeah, for sure. There was another town too that we have to mention, Chuck, Lytton, British Columbia, which is north, a couple hundred miles north of Seattle. They hit 116 and set a new record, not just for themselves, but for Canada as a whole. And then the town burned down from a wildfire right afterward.
Very sad.
So, like, it was a really big deal. And one of the things that I think the Pacific Northwest heat wave in June, and I think there were multiple ones around that region not just in the Pacific Northwest, but in like the Midwest states in particular this year. But what I think the heat waves in the U.S. this year kind of woke people up to is, like, these things are, like, really deadly. They looked at excess deaths, which they kind of take the background number of deaths, the deaths you'd expect, and then see how many more occurred on a particular day or over a particular period or during a heat wave. And they've concluded thus far that in Washington state alone, 600 people died from that heat wave over the course of a few days.
Yeah, like thousands of people total,
right,
all over that region.
Yeah,
and that's a little bit of a squishy number because and we'll talk a little bit about this, like people who study this kind of stuff. They're doing the best they can. They can't necessarily say like every single one of those deaths was because of the heat wave, but it is a really good measure. And if you're just looking at sort of round numbers, it's not the kind of thing that you can dismiss.
Yeah, and plus, if history is any kind of guide, those numbers will probably be revised upward in the next year or so, I would guess.
Yeah, and it's not just the United States. There was a heat wave in Europe in 2003 that was the warmest summer on record since the 1540s.
Yeah, and I was like, how do they know that?
I don't know.
So I looked. There's a bunch of different ways they can kind of
Parchment?
suss out. Yep, parchment is the answer. They take boreholes is basically one of the best ways I saw, where when it's hot on the Earth's surface, that temperature radiates downward through the Earth, and if you take a core sample, a borehole sample, you can actually kind of deduce from whatever temperature a specific moment in time is. Like, say, like in the 1540s, this would have been at the surface, that you can actually get the temperature roughly from that era.
I think we talked about that before.
Did
That sounds
we?
really familiar.
Okay, well, it sounded new to me. I had no idea, but I think that's pretty interesting. Because there was nobody in 1540 saying, oh, it was 80 degrees Celsius, it was super hot. Which I think that's like really, really hot if I'm not mistaken. But nobody was recording temperature like that. Some people did record the weather, but it was just like a smattering of observations and nothing scientific, because this is pre-scientific. So they have to use even more scientific stuff today to kind of deduce what it was before.
Right. You might see like it was very hot the day we burned this person at the stake.
Right. And we made it even hotter.
Glancing reference. But yeah, I mean, Milan, Paris, London, all these places broke record temperatures. Temperatures?
Yeah,
I can say that like a lazy southerner.
temperature?
Because of hookworm.
You say it like temperature.
Yeah. But in the couple of years after, they calculated that about 30,000 people died all over Europe. And then later on, they said that could have been as high as 70,000 people.
Yeah,
When they studied it years after that.
70,000 people died from a 2-week heat wave in Europe in 2003.
And this may be what we're looking at going forward.
Yeah, so we talked about, you were saying like that there's people who like are trying to figure out how much this is increasing, how much of it has to do with climate change. It's a new branch of science called attribution studies, and it's pretty much in league with climatology. I get the impression that it's made up of climatologists. and it's a brand new type of science, and it's really hard to do. But they're starting, from an article I read, the data set post climate change, basically this 1.2 degrees Celsius that has risen since we started keeping records in 1880, I believe. It's like the benchmark year. That it's starting to happen, like weird stuff is starting to happen in more and more frequency, that this data set is growing. And then they have since the 1880s to compare it against. And so using a lot more sophisticated statistical analysis than I can quite wrap my head around, they're figuring out how to say this weird weather event, like the one in the Pacific Northwest, had X chance of happening had climate change never happened, had we never started releasing greenhouse gas emissions during the industrial age. And they've actually done that. There was a study that actually kind of came to some pretty interesting conclusions about that.
Yeah, you hear about like a 100-year storm or something like that. They did a calculation and they said, this was that heat wave in 2021 of this year in the United States was a 1,000-year event. And that's factoring in like the current climate that we are already in.
Yeah, like if we froze, if our climate did not get any hotter or change in any way than it did now, from now on, that it would have been a 1,000-year event, like now, basically.
Right, and then they can further extrapolate and say, this was pre end of the 19th century, I guess?
Yeah, 1880. That's that benchmark date when everyone around the world started to keep like pretty accurate weather records from that point on.
They said that would have been about a 150,000-year event back then.
Yeah.
And in the future, it might become like a 5 or 10-year event.
Yeah, by the 2050s, maybe?
Yeah, because I think that it's like 30 or 40 years from now, the overall global temperature, there it is again, is going to rise another 2 degrees Celsius?
No, 2 degrees Celsius total since 1880.
Oh, okay, yeah. I guess that would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
It's not looking
I
good
don't know
anyway,
what would
but-
happen. I think we should do an episode explaining temperature rise and like what effects it's going to have and all that.
Sure.
So
I'll it under our Doomsday series.
So even taking aside like climate change and an increase from climate change, there's a lot of data that just says, yeah, we're actually seeing a lot more heat waves than we used to just in the past like 50, 60 years. And just taking data starting in 1960, I think the National Weather Service did a study that basically said, if looking at 50 cities in the United States, 46 of them have seen a statistically significant increase in heat waves since the 1960s. So much so that like during the 1960s, they could expect about 2 heat waves per year, these 50 cities in the United States. Now they're averaging about 6 per year. And the season for heat waves in these cities is on average 47 days longer than it was in 1960. So there's definitely a big upward trend in heat waves. It's becoming this new normal for us.
Yeah, and it's really all about data. The more data you have, because there are still freak weather events that they don't want to just throw everything in there and say it's all caused by the rising climates all over the world. But the more time goes on, like the more this data set is enriched and the wheat is separated from the chaff just sort of naturally, the more data you get, and those statistical anomalies will be revealed.
Yes.
As such.
Yeah, which I think it behooves us to say, like, if any good attribution climatologist is going to tell you, like, that heat wave in the Pacific Northwest could have just been statistical bad luck. It may have had nothing to do with climate change. It could have just been, like, that was the one we drew. Because a 1,000-year event means you have a 1 in 1,000 chance on any given year of that. It could happen next year again. It statistically is unlikely, but it's possible just from statistics that it was just bad luck that it happened. But yeah, what you were saying is actually totally accurate, that the more, unfortunately, weird freak weather events go on, the bigger the data set they're going to have to compare it to climate change times and see what is actually trending upward. And it looks like they're probably right about heat waves.
Yeah, and they, people should feel good knowing that they're really trying to get good, accurate data. It's not, they don't want to just be doomsday people and say, you know, they want to really get good, accurate numbers in there. So if you're a person who thinks climate change is bogus or it's not human caused or whatever, or they're just trying to scare you and, you know, they're going to throw everything in there that happens and say it's because of this. They're not doing that. They're really, really working super, super hard to get a super accurate record and picture of what things are like now and what they're like moving forward.
Yes.
You're not being hoodwinked.
I think people who are still saying that are basically like standing in a burning house being like, the house isn't on fire.
It's fine.
Yeah.
So what can we do to stop this stuff? Or, well, you can't stop it. What can